for April 2nd. We'll call the meeting to order, and I need an adoption of the agenda. The recommendation is that the agenda for the Committee of the Whole meeting of April 2nd be adopted as circulated. Councillor Ashley and Councillor Kinney. And all in favor? That's moved. Okay, statement of the Chair on the procedures for the Committee of the Whole meeting. Tonight's special Committee of the Whole meeting topic is the proposed public safety building. For those of you presenting this evening and for those of you watching via television, let me please explain that a Committee of the Whole meeting is a committee that consists of all members of Council. This meeting allows Council members to deal with issues in greater detail but is less formal than a regular meeting. During this meeting, issues are not formally adopted, but recommendations may be made at the next regular Council meeting. Some key points to remember when making your presentation or asking questions are: remember, Council meetings are televised, and it's very important to introduce yourself and, if applicable, name the organization that you are representing and speak directly into the microphone in a clear voice. When presenting, please address any comments or questions to the Chair of the meeting. Once you have completed your presentation, the Chair will then ask Council members if they have any questions. Then members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions. All questions and comments from the public should be stated in a respectful manner. I just want to remind people that this will strictly be about the buildings and nothing else. And if anybody else has questions for other city matters, we will be having at our next regular Committee of the Whole meeting scheduled April 23rd. They can bring those questions then. So just try to keep the flow of this meeting going just strictly with the public service building. Mr. Roden, could you give us some comments about our presenters this evening?
Certainly, Your Worship. I'd just like to make mention that Mayor Masalem and the City Manager are away in Edmonton on city business. Councillor Carlick Pearson is away for personal business reasons this evening, and Councillor Rice will be attending at approximately 8 o'clock. As you know, these meetings are recorded, and people who are not here will have an opportunity to find out what went on and bring themselves up to date when they return, so they won't miss anything. Tonight is the second meeting that Council has devised for discussion on the question of a public safety building, which may or may not entail two buildings or one consolidated building to house the RCMP and the fire department. As you've mentioned, the purpose of the meeting is to create, it's fairly loose in its format tonight, and the purpose is so that there's a free-form discussion and questions can be answered and asked when they arrive. The topic essentially tonight are what are the advantages and disadvantages of renovating versus building a new building, what exactly do the RCMP and the fire department need to have proper accommodation, and also at the end of the meeting I'll be discussing the concept of co-location with other entities. Tonight we have from the out of town, we've got Miss Michelle Miller, who's with the RCMP Asset Management, Mr. Eric Miller beside him, this is going left to right, who is involved with the RCMP Security, Inspector Bob Carrollberry, who manages the local RCMP detachment, Mr. Whitmer Abil, who is the architect, senior partner at KMBR Architects, their firm has been involved in numerous fire halls and RCMP construction projects over the year. Mr. David McKenzie, who is the fire chief locally, and Jeff Beckworth, who is the deputy chief. Thank you. And I believe Mr. Abil is going to start off tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Roden. Just a reminder that people can phone in. Is that what we're doing again?
Correct.
You can phone in your questions or email. Is that how we're doing it?
I believe that people at home will see on their TV set an email address, dan.roden@princerupert.ca, and also a telephone number, and we do have two operators standing by to take your questions.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Whitmore, if you want to proceed.
Is that working? Yeah. Okay. Well, good evening. Thank you for inviting me here to give this presentation. I'll just start out. Well, this is just an overview of the presentation. I'll talk quickly about team members and just a bit of background on my involvement, or my firm's and the team that I represent, the involvement with this project. We'll talk about the functional needs of the fire department and the RCMP detachment. And then we'll get to the question of whether to renovate or replace the buildings. And I'll have some building schematics to demonstrate some of the points that I'll make. So our team consists of my firm, KMBR Architects Planners Inc. So we have a civil engineer, Opus Dayton and Knight from Smithers, structural engineer, Fast and Epos from Vancouver, mechanical engineer, the MMM Group from Vancouver, electrical engineer, Acumen Engineering from Vancouver, and cost consultant, Spiegel, Skillen and Associates from Kelowna. And so we've been engaged by the city to engage in a needs assessment and planning study for the fire department and RCMP detachment, and to look at what makes the most sense for the city, whether we build individual facilities for fire and RCMP, or a joint use public safety building. Some of the project participants, I'm not going to read all the list, but we've had a fairly extensive process of consultation with a number of people from the fire department, RCMP, RCMP Asset Management in Vancouver, and some of the members of my team. So the process got started with the first meeting in July of 2011. We looked at a number of potential building sites to assess the feasibility of building these buildings on them. We had meetings with the RCMP and fire to assess their needs and come up with a program for their buildings. Received all available information from the city on the various sites and so forth. We then had a second meeting in August to review some of the preliminary analysis that we have done, to receive additional information and feedback. And then finally we had a third meeting on September 7th, which was a presentation of council of our progress to date, and followed by a discussion and feedback. And since then, the next step would have been this process of public consultation, and so this is where we are today. So to start with the needs assessment for fire and rescue services, this diagram on the screen indicates the various components that make up a fire hall, sort of summarized in their department headings. Administrative on the top left, excuse me, which includes a public reception area, offices, 911 call center, multi-purpose room and admin offices. Then the operations area, which is the apparatus bays, the hose tower, turnout gear room, gear laundry, workshop, the SCBA, tanks, compressor, and work area, hose and equipment storage. And we have living quarters, which includes the kitchen and eating area, rehab room, showers, washrooms, fitness room, and dormitories. And then, of course, we have service and support for the building, which includes the mechanical and electrical rooms. And then there's a component that's called the building gross up, which is your hallways, the amount of floor area that's taken up by walls and so forth. And so the total of that required the base requirement is 18,433 square feet. The current building measures roughly 9,085 square feet, and so that leaves about a shortfall of about 9,348 square feet of floor space. And I just want to emphasize these areas are industry standard. It's based on the size of the apparatus that the fire department has. There's based on my experience with other fire department facilities, there's really nothing excessive about it. This just represents the true need of the fire department. So similarly for the RCMP, we have a program, and of course this program is based on a national standard for RCMP facilities. This was provided to me by the by E-Division Asset Management Group in Vancouver. And Michelle, do you want to expand on that at all? Or?
The standards are set by Treasury Board and nationally across the country, and are the minimum standards necessary to provide operational services for the RCMP. So this has been a work in progress over the past few years, but this is the sort of final standards that have been approved and adopted, and they're very minimum. And in this case, this building is probably one of the smaller for the number of establishment. But basically, there's a public access area, which is the victim services for the public handicap reception, and then the next area is the general duty, which would be the offices, and there again the workstations are sort of set standard sizes with one or two private offices. General support is the exercise garage bays and sort of the operational standards required. And again, operational support would be exhibit storage, found property, very again sort of standards across the country. The cell block's the one area that's based on prisoner count, and it's I guess the 12 highest days that are calculated and to come up with the cell block. And in this case, there will be 2 holding cells and 10 cells based on the recent prisoner count. And Eric will probably talk a bit more about that. And then the final is just the final square footage of 18,294 for the total floor area. But that's probably. Thank you. Do you want to add anything with the cells? I don't know if there's.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. So the floor area requirement is 18,294 square feet. Based on that national standard, the current building has a gross floor area of 11,000 square feet. So that leaves a shortfall of 7,294 square feet. So the big question, of course, and one of the things, or main things we're asked to address tonight, is whether to expand and renovate or replace the facilities. And so if we start with the RCMP building, we've listed some of the major deficiencies of the building, and the first one is that the lot size is actually inadequate to support the current operation or required expansion, and I'll have some diagrams to expand on that in a minute. The building is undersized for current operational needs, which we've just seen based on the program. Structurally, the building is constructed of concrete masonry blocks, and it doesn't meet current building codes for post-disaster seismic design. And of course, police buildings and fire halls need to be designed to a post-disaster standard because they need to remain in operation, to serve the public safety needs of the citizens or the residents of the community. And in the event of a seismic event, this building would likely not be operational. The building envelope is compromised. Roof and walls are leaking. Cells do not meet any national RCMP standards in regards to safe custody. Cell block does not include required facilities, for example, secure interview room. And there are a number of health and safety issues. The HVAC system is inadequate and very efficient. So these are some of the highlights. Eric, do you want to expand on the cells or some of the other, and also Bob?
Certainly, I can speak to the cells. Since the time this facility was constructed, and most definitely over the period of about the last decade, the RCMP throughout the country has been working towards a suicide-resistant cell design. We've now had that, minor improvements for the last 5 years. Cells are always constructed with, mental health capacities being the unknown, and these cells are not constructed to any current standards. There's many, many risks associated with the existing cells.
Bob Kilberry. I'm going to chime in on that very point. In the last year, we've had 2 suicide attempts in our cells. So the risk is real. It's not something that we're making up, and it does put the risk of people in our custody, put anybody in our custody at risk.
Thank you. So with these major building deficiencies, it's clear to see that the building would require a very, very extensive overhaul, to the point where we would be sort of gutting it down to the bones and having to reconstruct a lot of it quite substantially. So the next diagram is a view of the site and the footprint of the existing building, the RCMP building. It's a 2-story building, but the second story is only about maybe 2,200 square feet in area, sort of in the middle of the footprint. It's also significant to note that there's a public lane that runs through the site, along the top edge of the site and then down the left. And the residences to that are to the north, I guess. I mean, north is sort of on 45, but let's call it north. Actually have access to their properties from this public lane. So there's no secure compound for RCMP cruisers and also for the secure bay for prisoner loading, unloading. So if we look at the next slide, which is an overlay of what should be there, we can see the requirement for a secure parking compound, access to, maneuvering access to the secure bays. We should have a bit of public parking at the street side, and then the area shaded in yellow is what represents the required expansion of the facility, the 7,294 square feet. So it's easy to see with this diagram that there's no way that all of the requirements, to meet current standards for an RCMP facility can be accommodated on this site, particularly given the fact that there's actually a public lane that runs through it.
Councillor Ashley, did you want to?
Sorry, is it all right to ask a question here? With reference to the last slide that you were just showing, I'm wondering why there's such a large need for that many parking stalls, because that's going to be a question that people would be asking. And I guess, in reference to that too, I'm just wondering what the standards that are here, are they based on a certain size detachment, and are they based on a certain size population? So.
It's based on the number establishment of the detachments, the number of members, and number of support staff. There's a formula that's driven process.
So the one that's there, is that based on our current detachment levels? And so then again, it would be the question about the parking. Because I'm just wondering, because right now, based on where it is, I don't see that many vehicles, and maybe they're in different places, so I'm just trying to get a sense of why all the parking is needed.
I'm not sure what all the spots would be for, but certainly you wouldn't want to park the police vehicles against the building for obvious reasons, because of the problems we experience right now with exhaust from the vehicles running into the building, being drawn into the building itself on the air exchange, and the yellow border or the red border is that the secure area?
No, that's actually actual property.
That's the actual property. Okay. So the overlay, I would say that we have probably 15 patrol cars, including the plainclothes unit. So you would have probably that back row would be taken up with police vehicles, and I'm not sure about the other area in there, what they have for secure parking. So you probably wouldn't need quite that much space for our current number of vehicles.
Are those parking spots at the back? Is that on the laneway? Is that on the lane right away? The ones on the north side? Those 20?
No, actually, the red outline. I'm just trying to find the arrow here. Is the boundary that I received from the city mapping system. But what's not shown here is the public lane. So you can just see the entrance to the lane here. So this is actually public lane back here, and then it wraps around and comes out here. And the neighboring private residences come right up to that red line.
And so those would look like parking spots on the other part.
No. This diagram indicates what is actually required. It's not what's there now. What's there now is this.
Yes, so they be arcing over top of the buildings.
Well, in theory, yeah. It's just for demonstration purposes.
Yeah, and the other question that I have, just based on the public lane there, and this is a question probably more for Mr. Roden or for staff, that public lane right now, is there other access for the people living in those residences? Like, do they have a separate access, or is that public lane necessary for them to get to their houses?
My understanding, and I'd have to check with the city planner, but they have access coming in off McBride and off 6th Avenue, so conceivably you could close one lane, but then you would only have access from one side or another, which I believe from the RCMP would constitute a problem for them.
Councillor Ashley, I think you're talking about the homes on 5th Avenue, so they all have access from 5th Avenue side as well as the lane allowance.
But I don't believe they have driveways.
No.
Go ahead, Mr. Abel.
Okay. So to then talk about some of the renovation issues, we talked about the site being too small. Excuse me. One of the major issues that you're facing with renovating a building, especially an RCMP facility like this, is the cost and logistics of a phased construction and partial relocation, because for obvious reasons the detachment has to remain in operation, And so a major renovation project would almost certainly have to be phased, where you're going into just parts of the building and doing the work, and of course the areas that you're affecting would somehow have to be relocated temporarily. So there's the cost of that, and just simply the logistics of the logistical problems of doing that. The cost of a major renovation, and this is based on my experience, and anybody who's been through a home renovation, an extensive home renovation, will be able to relate to that. But the cost of a major renovation, plus an expansion that we're looking at here, is would almost certainly equal the cost of constructing a new building, particularly when we're looking at this the added burden of phasing the construction, which is what we would certainly have to look at here. And then the final result of a renovation and expansion would be less than optimal, because, as you can appreciate, many of the areas that are undersized now are within this existing building footprint. And so it's not just a simple case of adding the 7,000 square feet on one end of the building and you're done. You really have to reorganize and revamp the existing footprint and the existing layout. The cell block, though, is poorly located if we're adding on the other side of it, because it basically cuts the operation in half. If that's what we were planning to do here. And this is based. If we go back to the to this diagram, so the cell block is where I'm pointing the arrow, sort of on the left-hand side of the building footprint, and then. If we're adding on the other side of that, then the expansion area is basically cut off from the existing building, or you're into replacing the cell block altogether, which is maybe a more likely scenario. But then you're demolishing a good portion of the building and rebuilding it. So the economic feasibility of this is really not really not there.
Councillor Ashton?
Thank you. So just pretending for a second, because I realize it's not, but if the lot itself, because I realize the current lot is too small, but if the lot was not too small, or we were able to somehow get the amount of land that was needed, right? Would it entail the same type of costs that you're talking about? Like if we weren't talking about having to fit it into that particular box?
It's tough to answer that without knowing what this reconfigured lot would look like, but the cost of upgrading the existing facility and expansion, I don't see how it would make a big difference, really.
Councillor Thorkelson?
I was wondering. If we had to look at this lot, forget about moving the RCMP, let's pretend we just didn't have to have RCMP for a year. So if we were able to, is that footprint large enough if we tore everything down, started from new? One of the problems, of course, of building anything new is if we are building on unprepared land, the costs are exceedingly high. Because you have to do land prep first. So if we use this footprint and if we went up instead of out, would we be able to do that? Or would we be able to go up and without having to tear that building down? So I guess there's two questions. Can we go up without tearing the building down? structurally? And secondly, if we flatten the building, could we rebuild on that footprint and go up, so we didn't have to look for another space? And I guess one of the things is I was thinking is that if that is a square footage for the required expansion, that green area, can that be on a second floor, which means that you would be able to park underneath it? That's where part of the parking area is now, correct? And that would, if you could park underneath it, that would give you additional parking spots as well as they'd be covered parking spots. So I was wondering if that would be satisfactory, or if the lot is just too small entirely.
Okay. If we were starting from scratch with a new building on this lot size, it's quite likely that there's adequate land area, provided that we could close off the public lane. If the public lane was brought into this property and was not required for public access, then this size of lot would likely be adequate. I have another slide a little bit later that shows kind of a hypothetical footprint and layout of a new facility, and land area, roughly 30,000 square feet of a lot size would be sort of the minimum. The second question was, can we go vertical, expand upward, and without doing a detailed structural analysis of the existing building, I would say I can't really answer that, but again, we're facing the seismic issues, but unless the existing foundations and structure has been built to accommodate a second floor, the answer to that would be no. But again, I'd like to just recall that the seismic design of the existing building is not adequate, and so it would be very difficult to add vertically. With regards to lifting the expansion and parking underneath, I'll let Eric address that from a operational security perspective.
As a general rule, we don't allow underground parking, under structure parking. It's more or less become a national standard. Our new E-Division headquarters being constructed in Surrey, there was long debate over putting subterranean parking there, and it was denied through our security branch in Ottawa because of obvious risks imposed. Having street level parking or at grade parking with the structure above, in my opinion, is going to have the exact same threat effects as subterranean parking. From a previous existence prior to this role, dealing in construction, to do a suspended slab and parking underneath, there isn't any realization of cost. You're really looking at a lot of engineered construction to accommodate that, especially at this point, not knowing exactly what's going to be up there. For example, you put a file room above that, it's going to have to be a lot more weight bearing than general office space.
Continue.
Could you explain to me what the threats would be for having parking underneath on street level underneath the building?
Absolutely. Worst case scenario, an IED, an improvised explosive device, a vehicle explosion, even if it's a non-intentional explosion. In fact, sometimes cars catch on fire and blow up. You're now containing that within a cylinder, and it becomes a pipe bomb type scenario. The blast has to go somewhere. You have building pressures, and it's magnified by the fact it's contained.
Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions about the RCMP detachment question of renovation or replacement. If not, we'll move on to the fire hall.
Councillor Ashley.
The other question, and it's just a thought because we're trying to be creative here, we know that this is an expensive prospect and everything else, is again, considering not like if we were able to increase the lot size, whatever it is, right, is there any possibility of using prefabricated buildings? Councillor Thorkelson at a separate meeting was mentioning something that she had heard something about, I don't know if it was cells or something along those cells that had been put together for, I can't remember where it was, remote areas, and I'm wondering, is there any room for doing something like that, or if that's even been considered?
I can speak to that unofficially because I'm not a dollars and cents guy. We do have a remote community that just in British Columbia that just got our first modular detachment of the new design. The main initiative behind it was due to the remoteness and the cost of stick building on site, and there was a realization of savings due to that. My guess would be the location of Prince Rupert. We would be spending more in the long run, especially ongoing O&M. Reality is modular buildings don't generally last as long as built-in-place structures. The modular cell itself, there is a prototype currently being constructed, but not. It's not so much for detachment use. It's more for major events. So the Olympics happening in Whistler, something like that. Essentially, it's going to be a semi-trailer with cells.
Yeah, if I can add to that, it's my understanding from the RCMP design manual that the modular buildings are not meant for permanent detachments. Added to that is the building code requires the cell block to be actually constructed of non-combustible construction, so that kind of rules out wood and modular wood buildings. So they really need to be constructed of steel or concrete to meet building code. So if we look at now the fire hall, this is the footprint of the existing fire hall. The red outline is the current property. We have the little museum building on the left-hand side, then the two-story fire hall with living quarters and offices in the middle, and then the apparatus space on the right, and the little hose tower to the right of that. The entire sort of upper half of the property is there's actually a part of it is occupied by the Crest parking lot, and then it's a fairly steep bank just between the parking area and the fire hall building. And then what's left over for the fire department is just this little rectangular area on the bottom right-hand corner of that property. So again, looking at remembering the needs assessment that we did earlier, and the square footage that we arrived at, if we look at an overlay onto this site, and this is what it would look like. So the new fire hall with an 18,430 square foot footprint. Well, it's not the footprint; it's actually the gross floor area, and that implies that part of it is a two-story building, allowing adequate space at the front of the building, so the fire truck can pull out safely before making the turn onto the road. Allowing some training and maneuvering space at the back, as well as some staff parking. This is kind of what we're looking at. So the the requirement for the land area is almost double what it is now. Chief, did you want to make some comments in addition to that? Or?
No, I think you've covered everything quite well.
Okay.
Councillor Ashley?
So same question as I had for the RCMP building. I'm wondering what the size and the requirements are based on in terms of numbers of population or detachment size, and if it's the equivalent of what our detachment size is now. So.
The square footage is required. There is a standard rating through NFPA compliancy, and that is documented. I do have a report that will be on the website later on from a consultant, outside consultant, that's also did some work on the fire hall. And in here it states everything from WorkSafe coverage to NFPA compliancy that's required for training facilities, amount of square footage needed to do proper exercises and equipment operation.
Go ahead, Councillor.
On that on that lot, the square footage, is it possible to put the is there enough room just for the fire trucks? Forget about everything else. Is there enough room for the fire trucks? And then can you build all the offices, etc., on top of the fire trucks?
Well, much of the requirement for the lot is actually in maneuvering. The standard of the day is to have drive-through apparatus space, and this is what's indicated here. You can see the arrows coming in through the back of the apparatus bays and then exiting from the front. And of course, the larger ladder trucks, etc., have quite a significant turning radius, and that's what's indicated by this circle, the dashed circle at the back. So even if you were to stack all of the offices and living quarters on top of the apparatus bay, you still wouldn't eliminate the need for this the space at the back of the building. So the answer would be no. You could not accommodate that on this property.
But that's not inside a building, is it? The training and maneuvering?
No, that's outside. So the building is all the area that's designated in red. That would be the building and the hose tower.
Okay, so my question again is I don't want to care about the training maneuvering because maybe we can do that somewhere else, but I'm just wondering, is the present available footprint large enough to accommodate the fire trucks if we put all of the admin and everything else on top of the building, and the fire trucks would still have to back in? I know that drive-through is certainly preferable, right? But if that can't occur, then if we only had the fire trucks on the bottom floor, could we build a proper station with the admin and all of the other parts of the building on the top floor, so that it would be wide enough, it would be tall enough, so the fire trucks could go in and out even if they had to back in, but it would be wide enough and tall enough to enable them to do that, not like it is now. I mean, that's just really goofy the way it is now. And then with all of everything on top.
No, as compliancy is now for, as I said earlier, NFPA compliancy and WorkSafe, they require you to have a certain amount of ground. So even if you built on the same footprint as it is now, it's already larger than the actual property outline. Maybe able to compress it and build up, but it still doesn't. When building the new building, you still have to have adequate training and maneuverability of the equipment as required by code. So even if we did build up, we're still not meeting the standard as required through NFPA and WorkSafe for operation of trucks for safety, for room for allowance for backing in. We're coming off a busy street and backing apparatus in. That's where accidents happen, and that's the idea of having these drive-through bays. So when building a new construction, they want to allow to have drive-through bays to minimize incidents.
I think what Councillor Thorkelson's looking for is if we can't afford to build a new building right now, could we expand, say, maybe the garage and build on top of it? Is that kind of where you're going? And sort of make do with that existing piece of property for now till we could go somewhere else?
I think we still come to the same conclusion as the RCMP, that we're not post seismically safe. We have to be, when we rebuild, the cost of doing that to the structure and then building up, and then the engineering cost of designing and seeing if we can actually engineer and build more structure on top of what we have already. There's the ground right now is still settling and moving. We're sinking as it is.
Yeah,
so there's a process to go through, but
I think the concern is if we can't afford to do both, but we do one, can we put a few more Band-Aids on, which isn't a good thing either. But
I couldn't answer that for you on that.
That's something that we have to look at.
That's something you can expand on.
But the other thing is, I understand it's very difficult and almost impossible to work in a building that's being renovated. So, those are other logistic nightmares.
Right. So the purpose of this diagram is just to indicate, the difference between the size area required and what we have now. The next slide talks a little bit about the renovation issues, and it's really exactly the same as we have for the RCMP. We have the cost and logistics of temporary relocation of the fire and rescue operation. Structurally, it does not meet current codes for post-disaster seismic design, so building on top of the apparatus bays is probably not advisable to expand the building. Cost of the cost of renovation and expansion for this building, aside from the inadequate site size, would almost certainly equal the cost of new construction, and the final result would just be less than optimal again. So, putting any money into this building, I think, is throwing good money after bad. Can you make do for another? I don't know how long. I mean, that's a decision that council has to make. Are there any other questions about the existing fire hall?
Mr. Roden.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Gordy Heber has phoned in, and he'd like to know the location of a drive-through fire hall. Does anyone know where there is one where they have the drive-through base?
You mean what other city has them?
Yeah, not a drive-in fire hall, but a drive-through fire hall.
So you're talking about what other communities have?
Yes, Your Worship.
Okay.
The location.
Okay, I understand that the closest one would be Williams Lake, but certainly in the Lower Mainland, that is absolutely the standard for any new fire hall facility. So, sorry, there's Smithers, BC. Oh, Smithers, I understand. Yeah, I mean, to put it another way, I don't know any new facilities that are being built that are not drive-through.
Okay, I think you can continue on till the next questions come up.
Okay. So I just have a few more slides to talk about new construction and single-use versus joint-use building. So this diagram indicates, again, we're showing the requirement for both fire and RCMP as individual buildings on the left-hand side. So fire, the fire hall with 18,430 square feet, the RCMP with a gross floor area requirement of 18,299 square feet. And so for separate facilities, the combined gross floor area, pardon me, would be 36,729 square feet. And then on the right-hand side would be the scenario of providing a joint use public safety building. What we can see on the bottom is the total gross floor area requirement is actually reduced as compared to the two standalone facilities. And the reason for that is that some of the components of the two buildings could be potentially shared. And what we've seen in the past, where we've had these joint use public safety buildings, is obviously the mechanical, electrical equipment of the building can be combined in the same space. We've also seen a common fitness facilities, multi-purpose meeting rooms can also be shared, and so comparing these two, we're seeing about somewhere around 2,000 square foot of savings potentially in floor area by building both facilities under one roof as a joint use facility.
Councillor Ashley.
Thank you. So just to be clear, with the RCMP, this is not including the rural policing that's separately located right now, right?
That's correct. It's not including the rural, but I think being forward-looking, you'd want to keep that as an option, that they may come eventually, but that's a negotiation that would have to be had with the current tenant or the province.
So the next slide is just a hypothetical layout of the fire hall. It's very similar to the one we saw previously overlaid onto the existing site. We have the 4 apparatus bays in this case, drive-through. On the left would be a 2-story component with the admin and office and other operational areas, and a 2nd-story component with living quarters, fitness room, etc. And then a hose tower at the back. The maneuvering area and training yard, some allowance for parking for staff, and just maneuvering from the front to the back of the site. So we're coming to a site area of about 40,000 square feet, so just a little under an acre. The diagram on the right-hand side of the slide it's sort of a schematic section through the building. So on the right-hand side we have the apparatus bays, which would be sort of the equivalent of 2 stories in building height, and then on the left we can see the operations and admin and living components stacked one on top of the other. So that's a fairly efficient way of achieving that square footage. The next slide is an indication of, again, a hypothetical footprint for the RCMP detachment. 18,299 square feet, mostly stacked in a 2-story configuration, as the little schematic on the right indicates. There's probably a slightly larger floor area on the ground floor, because the program doesn't quite lend itself to stack completely or neatly as a stacked configuration. Again, we have a requirement for a secure operational parking and access to the garage bays, and a little bit of parking for the public in the front. And so we're looking at a site size of about 30,000 square feet for the RCMP alone.
And how big was the fire hall? 40.
About 40.
40?
Yeah. and main reason for that is that you just need such a large amount of space to maneuver these, especially the ladder trucks. And this is the last slide, and this is a possible scenario of a joint use public safety building with fire hall and RCMP kind of side by side, with common public entrance in the center. Each, of course, has has its own requirement for parking and secure areas, which would be separated at the back. And then the schematic on the right-hand side indicates how the two would come together with some shared use in between. On the main floor, we'd have the shared lobby, for example, and on the upper floor, shared fitness room, possibly, and a shared multi-purpose meeting room. So. And that is how we would achieve some savings in floor area. Now, with that, of course, you need to have a site that's large enough to accommodate joint use building.
I have a quick question. It's probably more for the security, but it's actually a shared lobby. Is that a secure area for RCMP? Like, you have two totally different uses, so I don't understand how you could share that.
Sorry. Yes, the RCMP would still have its own reception area, which would be more or less secure. This just indicates more of a common entryway, and from there you could sort of go to the right and enter through a door for the RCMP, and to the left to access the fire department.
My only concern is they get a lot of school-age children going for tours through there, so I guess the back end of the building is where you're dealing with bringing in your prisoners and not through the front door. Is that correct?
Correct.
That's correct. And of course, there would be anybody that was in police custody would be in the secure area of the building, not like it is currently.
Okay, well, that basically brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Councillor Ashley.
So with this one, because for the previous ones you said 40,000 minimum and 30,000, so what would be the minimum site lot that you would need for this?
Well, it would be close to the combined total. You would probably achieve some efficiency, so it's probably not quite the 70,000, but we would have to study it in more detail to give you a definitive answer. But I think it's safe to say that you could achieve some economies in site size as well.
But so approximately 70,000 square feet?
That would be a safe starting point, yeah.
Councillor Kinney.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to our Fire Chief, Dave. Dave, do we need that tower anymore? Do we not have hoses that don't need the drying? Like the modern, or are we still in the Stone Age?
No, we're still required to have the hose tower. We do have a lot of canvas product that we test yearly, and plus the rubber hose, but we still need a place to dry them. And we also need a facility for training for everything from high-angle rope rescue to just firefighting and drills themselves.
Mr. Roden, do you have anything from the public?
No, I don't, Your Worship. Perhaps people in the gallery?
Yeah. Do you want to come forward, Mr. Golden, or? If you go sit beside Mr. Roden, maybe you can use the microphone over there.
Sure.
Going along with what Joy was asking, you were mentioning 15 cars. When I go by the RCMP, I don't see 15 cars there. So, are you sure that you haven't combined the two detachments?
Currently, there's 2 plainclothes vehicles, 8 municipal vehicles, 1 dog, 1 community service vehicle, so that's 13 right there. And then any visiting vehicles that may be from either from the rural detachment or from another detachment that's bringing somebody in, as well as the sheriff's vehicle that needs secure parking when they're there. So, yeah, at least 15.
The other one was, because someone noticed, is our hospital seismically, I mean, you guys are putting...
Mr. Golden, we're not here about talking about the hospital, so...
But we're saying priorities, these guys have to be seismically... So if the hospital isn't there, they aren't going to be able to do anything.
Your Worship,
Mr. Roden.
Your Worship, staff will investigate what the capability of the hospital is.
Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Golden?
He was mentioning the fire NFB and NFPA. Can you say, what are those things?
NFPA is your National Fire Protection. If it's not WCB code related that we follow, it'll be the NFPA that we go by.
Which code are we required to go by, WCB or both? Or
first, it'll follow WCB, and if WCB doesn't have it, then we fall under NFPA. But a lot of WCB stuff does come through the NFPA.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Golden.
Could I ask one more? I still don't see why you couldn't be doing this out of 3 different buildings. So why couldn't you move part of the detachment downtown to one of the malls or something like that? So. Sure, this isn't in a long term, but the other thing is, what happens if the town grows 50%? Then your new building is too small. So I think in this transition period, it's more let's use what we've got and see where the town's going.
I'm not sure who wants to answer that one. Mr. Kilbury or Inspector Kilbury?
Certainly from an operational perspective, it's not ideal to be separated, to split the detachment up into separate locations. We see that right now with our rural section that's working out of a different building and the economies that are lost there. All the admin records are held in one place, so if a person has to work on a file, he has to come back to pull the files. Operational files are not to leave the building, and so that would require them to come back to that detachment to do their work. So there's certainly no advantage to splitting this up.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, Mr. Golden?
Yeah, that's why we have electronic, so you could do things electronically, and then the paper file could be sitting in one place.
Okay, well, we'll take those things into consideration, Mr. Golden. Thank you. Anybody else have questions from the gallery? Could you come forward where Mr. Golden's sitting, please, and state your name and address? I forgot to have Mr. Golden do that, but we're kind of familiar with him.
I'm Boyd Cook, and I live on 2nd Avenue West. I really don't know if what kind of a building is really required. We have these steel buildings now that can be well insulated. For instance, where the other detachment is down in Cal Bay, that is a nice piece of property. It's good, solid property because I worked there and it was all stone. So foundation-wise, building down in that area or utilizing that type of building, I'm not so sure wouldn't be a good idea.
I think you raise a good point there, but I think the building that it currently is in is a private building that's leased, and we are still looking at other options and other pieces of property. We haven't really nailed anything down. Is that right, Mr. Abel?
That's correct. We really don't have any sites defined yet.
And we haven't any architectural drawings of what kind of building materials we're looking at this point in time, have we? Or
No, we haven't advanced to that point yet.
So thank you for your information. Yeah.
Howard Gray. I guess we can all dream about having a perfect building, but this is a Cadillac when all we can afford is a Volkswagen. I mean, that Terrace doesn't have a drive-through fire hall. They have 3 bays. They do it for a heck of a lot less than what Prince Rupert does as far as the overall cost of the fire department and the RCMP. And a huge discrepancy. RCMP in Terrace has a nice building, a fairly new structure. Where in Prince Rupert are you going to find a piece of property that will accommodate this kind of structure? And the reason that I question that when we're talking about trying to build something of this nature, there's a company here in Prince Rupert that is building a new warehouse. And what they ran into and what it's going to cost them for their foundation is absolutely astronomical. And unless you've got a piece of property picked out with the engineering done on it, we're talking about pie in the sky here, because, I mean, we could be talking 10 million, you could be talking 20 million. So if there is no piece of property that has been picked yet,
that's been our challenge with the whole process here. Like that's why we're having these meetings. That's why we're digging for information and trying to figure out what will work best for us. So, Mr. Roden, did you have something to add?
I was just going to basically say what you're saying, Your Worship. You're correct, sir. We haven't picked a location. We're simply looking at all the possibilities. We're trying to, as the mayor says, we're trying to figure out what will work, what won't work. Certainly there's probably pieces of property in the town that could be acquired, but it might be expensive. There may be a lot of site development on those pieces of property that would make something like this simply cost prohibitive. But at this point in time, we're simply saying, well, if we were going to go to a joint building, what's the potential for savings? And Mr. Abel has identified that there's approximately 2,000 square feet that could be saved. But that possibly, as you pointed out, you may have engineering that could vastly exceed that amount of money. Yeah. So you're correct.
The problem being that what we're talking about here is not the land size, we're talking about the building size. So the land that would be required to be able to put something like a joint building on is a lot larger than 70,000 square feet. And I mean, in Prince Rupert, I probably know every square inch of this as well as most do, to try and find. I mean, so if we're looking at a single building for possibly the RCMP and trying to renovate the fire department, because the other point that I would like to make here is that whatever ends up happening here and whatever building ends up being designed, it better not be a testament to an architect, because that's what's led us to this problem right now. That RCMP building is a disgrace. Thank you.
Those are my concerns as well. I want a building that's built to good standards, but if we want to have great architectural aspects to it, we can't really afford those things. So I think that we've kind of given some direction, if I'm not mistaken, to Mr. Abel about those things. So we do want to make sure we have a good quality building that's going to last, and you can still build a nice looking building without getting too architecturally involved in things. So, yeah. So thank you for your concerns, and we share your concerns, and thanks for coming forward. Anybody else? Councillor Ashley.
This kind of comes back to the question that I had about the rural policing, because I understand they're in a separate facility, and as Inspector Kilberry has pointed out, that's not necessarily an optimum situation. It would be nicer to be together. So along those lines, what I'm wondering is, are there other possible ideas for partnership? Because when we start talking about cost, and I think maybe Mr. Roden has something to say about that.
If we're finished with this part of the discussion, Councillor Ashley's comment and question is a perfectly good segue into what I wanted to say next. Are we good to go?
Oh, Councillor Thorkelson, we'll just wait. Yeah.
I still have questions, and they're with regards to the again to the footprint and what the options we have. And if we did a new building, is there an option to either a singular building for each or one building for both? Is there an option to go up instead of having such a large footprint? Or is that not? Are there any security reasons why we can't go up other than out, for example?
From a security perspective, we can go up, absolutely, but there are certain services that must be at grade just for operational flow, such as a cell blocks access through a secure bay that you have to be able to drive into. Other than that, it just determined by operational flow and operations of the detachment. I have no issue with going up.
Mr. Gray, did you want to come forward again?
The municipality is in the RCMP's case. The municipality is responsible for funding a municipal detachment. Is that correct? So if this was to be a joint rural and municipal, is there the possibility of joint revenue sharing, not revenue sharing, but cost sharing in the actual construction of that facility?
Inspector Kilbury or Michelle.
In the ideal world, it would be benefit to both the province and the federal government if there's cost sharing. But the problem right now with the new municipal contract, the province isn't able to commit to any long-term sharing of costs. So in the perfect world, a building would be built, so it would be 50% municipal, and the rural would be there as well, and the province would pay their share in rent. But given the new detachment and the new contract and the unsureness right now where that's going, the province can't commit to a long-term, a 20-year, maybe in the future, but not right now.
So under the new contract that has just been signed, there's a provision in there for municipalities to have more of a say in the policing, the level of policing and the policing costs. I don't know if this is the forum for, or the particular meeting for just having that discussion, but it leads to, as a taxpayer and a citizen, longtime citizen, like trying to come up in my own mind, what is reasonable, because up to this point we've had no say, or almost no say, in the level of policing that we're expected to pay for.
Mr. Roden, could you answer that question? Or about the level of policing that we're allowed to maybe, or I'm not sure, maybe Inspector Kilbury, between the two of you, if you can kind of.
Well, how about I wing it and Bob, you jump in. The force that the city of Prince Rupert, the authorized strength is 36 FTE. Okay. The city has not had 36 FTE for many, many years. In 2007, we were down to 28. Since then, we've gone to 29, last year to 30. And those of you who watched the budget presentation last week, you'll see that the RCMP feel that it would be advantageous to the community if they had a senior staff sergeant. Mr. Kilburg?
Yes, certainly from our perspective, we feel that it would be advantageous to the community to have a senior investigator at the sergeant level on a general investigation section. We've seen over the past year that our persons crimes have increased. It's the only area of crime that's really has increased over the past year, and those are crimes that are committed against persons, and so they're the more violent crimes. And to put more resources towards the investigation of those type of crimes and efforts towards preventing them, I think makes good sense for the community. At this point in time, that comes at the expense of the dogman. I mean, we've had a dog in this community for a number of years. That member has left the community, and so now whether we staff that position with another dog person or we fill the position with the GI position, that's what we're looking at right now.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll just try to focus on the building needs. I think we'll stay the course there. Mr. Gray, do you have any more questions?
Well, I find it a little, I guess, confusing that our population has dropped from 20,000 to 12,000, and the policing level hasn't kept in touch or hasn't kept track with that. With the advent of computers and other tools that can be used instead of doing everything by hand.
I think Mr. Kilper or Inspector Kilper can help me out with this one, but when they came out with the new Prime computer program, we ended up having to hire extra people to work on that program. And policing, from the knowledge that we've gained on council from the RCMP, is that policing has changed. So with new technologies, I think it's actually made policing more, what would the word be? Help me out here, Mr. Inspector Kilbury.
Certainly investigations take longer to do now. They're more complex now than they used to be. I mean, everyone pleads not guilty. It's now not a matter of proving who did it. It's proving who didn't do it. So, I mean, it's how you do an investigation has changed considerably from the times in the 70s where an impaired driver could be done in 2 hours to now it's taking 4 hours to do that same investigation. So the advent of electronic file management certainly has improved the ability to access material, to make it more retrievable, to make it more searchable, but it certainly hasn't decreased the amount of work to do the data input.
And if I can add, I think the other problem with the detachment right now is I don't know how long you have to keep evidence, but when you have to keep that and store it, your storage room becomes less and less functional. So that's another problem that's the building has. Councillor Thorkelson?
I can't remember what the other questions are or when. So maybe this is too early in the series of information meetings to ask a question. But this is really directed at the fire department and at the police separate questions. First of all, for the fire department, my question is if we is it necessary to have not suggesting that, I'm not saying it wouldn't be nice, okay? But is it necessary to have a drive-through area? And is it necessary to have that training area? Not saying that whether you would like to have it or not, right? But is it necessary to have it? If we could keep that same, the land is a problem. If we were able to keep that same, stay in that same area, and I know there's a lot of other things. We're going to talk about those other issues, but would you be able to be efficient, and would you be able to house your needs if we expanded the apparatus, the garage? Okay, we made the garage bigger, so it was big enough for the fire trucks, and then we're able to put something on top of that. Crest might not like it, but if we were able to do something like that, would that be sufficient, or would you see larger trucks coming in? Like what would you see as? Would that be sufficient if we were able to do something like that?
Well, that becomes a tough question to answer because it becomes down to a decision of what council and mayor want to do at the time. Would it be sufficient for short term? It may. We are required by code to have sufficient training grounds on site. We also need to have proper grounds to maneuver our fire trucks. When this fire hall was built back in 1959, our fire apparatus were as big as our rescue. Now they're 4 times that size and much wider, and still accommodating the same housing. So yes, if you increase it, that's fine, but we still need, we have to look after the safety aspect for our the workers and the public when we're moving this apparatus in and out of the apparatus floor. That's the idea of having drive-through apparatus or apparatus bays. Any new fire hall that's built now, code does state that It is required to have. Fort St. John is just building their new fire hall. They have drive-through bays going in there. On this footprint, you could build up, but still you don't have the training facility or the training grounds required for the apparatus for their potential and or for the safety of moving apparatus in and out off of main busy road.
I'm Councillor Thorson.
And so we're not compliant right now. Is obviously, and so if we're not compliant right now, is that they're saying anything new has to be built like that?
If anything new or if you upgrade, you'll have to become compliant. As of now, we're already into 2 building codes since this, and we're coming to a 3rd building code, I think, later this year, update again, which is saying that anytime you upgrade or build emergency services building, whether it's an RCMP or fire department, it's required.
And I guess my other question is there's been, and I'm not going to discuss the pros or cons or what my feelings are, but there's been quite a movement afoot to have the fire department go to volunteer fire department. Have you looked at what it would take in footprint in buildings if you went to say a terrace model where you have some people working and more volunteer, right? Would you need the same training area? Would you need a larger training area? Would you need a smaller training area? Would you need, all of the things that they put up there, all of the different kinds of offices, et cetera, that they have for the building?
Yeah, you'd still be required to have, if not more than what we're already asking for. Due to the amount of staffing coming in, you still need training facilities, accommodations for the staff that come in. Large social rooms for. You're going to require more room because of more people coming in if you do change the model.
So volunteer fire departments buildings aren't smaller, or what are they? I guess that was my question.
Again, it all depends on which location and what they're building. But now what they're building today's standards, when you're building, you're going to require the same, if not more, room. Whether it's a composite hall to meet the needs of everything from emergency operation centers to the dispatch that's required still to apparatus floors, training grounds.
Councillor Ashley?
Just another question along similar lines, but towards the more of the RCMP detachment. I think we all realize that there's deficiencies in both buildings. There's no doubts there. One question that I've had throughout this whole process is we've had letters from the RCMP about what things are not up to standard and things, and there's 2 questions along this line. The first one is with the RCMP contract, and I realize there's a new one kind of in the works, etc. But with the RCMP contract, what exactly is it that says or determines what those needs are? And when I say that is when I asked for the fire hall, they said, well, okay, national, I can't remember what the name is, but like the NFP standards. But in the contract, what is it that says what the requirements of the municipality are in terms of detachment requirements?
Mr. Roden?
Or even in the previous contract, I'm just wanting to know, because it's a question not only have I been wondering, but people have been asking, right? Because we're in the process of doing this, and like, well, why do we have to? What is it that says?
Councillor Ashley, I'm going to get Mr. Roden to jump in.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I can't speak to the new contract because I haven't read it from cover to cover, but in the old contract, what it says is that pursuant to this agreement, which is the agreement between the municipality and the RCMP, that the municipality will supply accommodation. Then it goes on to say that the accommodation has to be deemed satisfactory by the commissioner of the RCMP. So from that, it's basically, we need to do what he or she, wherever the commissioner is, says is satisfactory. And then what they would probably do, and I believe Ms. Miller can help me out there, is that they refer to all their security requirements, cell requirements, staffing, space per person, and all that. So they probably have a huge corpus of regulation that they refer to, and they say this is the national standard for the RCMP. If your building is not up to this standard, then I, the commissioner, deems that is unsatisfactory, and you need to do something about it.
Councillor Ashley, yeah, I'll let you finish that, and then there's a couple call-in questions.
Okay, sorry. Follow-up question to that. So I get it. There's suitable, and then there's like a whole set of standards. I guess the question becomes, and it comes to the we don't have a champagne budget. I don't even know if we have a beer budget. But at that point, what ones of those, because there's so many different things, and we're trying to find a way with the community and what we can afford to try and address the issues. So how do you determine which things are the absolute necessity and which things are the things that, yeah, it'd be nice, but that's not necessary in terms to enforce whatever the penalty is when that third letter goes in, or whatever that we've been told about, that the first letter has already been sent in? So
we've got a book called the RCMP Property Management Manual, and with it, in that book, it lists room construction for 99.8% of whatever's in a detachment. Most of those come as a non-discretionary standard, so there's a minimum of services we have to supply within our detachment. And most of it has to do with safety of the community, safety of our clients, safety of our victims. Cell blocks being one, interview rooms, and it's not just building a room for interview, but that room has to have a sound transmission coefficient rating and a speech privacy for victims or for a lawyer client. The list is pretty exhaustive, but that book is essentially is what we have to follow. They're non-discretionary. None of it was created arbitrarily. That's part of the reason why it takes so long for us to settle on a standard, is all the testing things go through. Our cell block fixtures, everything in our cell block gets tested by a group called Mechanical Security Services Section, just approving caulking, like the grout for round toilets. So we just got an approval. It took 18 months to get it. So our hands are tied in a lot of things. There's not a whole lot of discretion in terms of the facilities that must be provided within the detachment. Where some of the discretion comes is the architectural marvel that some of our detachments wind up becoming, but we're all very cognizant of the fiscal restraints.
Mr. Roden, you've got a couple questions for us.
Yes, I do, Your Worship. The first question is from Elizabeth Mellison of 104 Cormorant, who wants to know what the population of the RCMP detachment building and the fire hall department building were initially built to support. So I'm going to need some help here, because they were built at two different times. But if the fire hall was built in 1959, what would have been the population back then approximately?
Are you talking about the population of the city, or how many firefighters were working, or how many RCMP officers?
I'm assuming that it's the population of the city, Your Worship. Does anybody have an idea on council?
1959?
Yeah.
Probably. Nelson, what do you think? Maybe 1959, maybe like 13,000? I don't know. Well, no, the pulp mill was here then. Yeah.
We were in average around 20,000.
In 59?
Yeah.
Is that right through the year, or is that just the summer season?
Well, that's with our fishing fleets.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would say it's probably 15,000. With just who's living here?
Yeah.
Because by 1980 we were almost at 20,000.
Okay, Ms. Mellison, I hope that answers your question. If not, please phone back and we'll try and get some clarification for you. The second question is, it's three questions, and it's from Mr. Frank Warren of 910 10th Avenue East. The first question is there any allowance for future expansion needs being built into the plan of a joint building? Does anybody want to take that one on?
Mr. Abel?
Future expansion is always a good idea, or allowance for future expansion. So depending on the site that we're we end up with, we would certainly take that into consideration.
Councillor Thorkelson.
Okay.
I had those two questions, and this one I think that I'd like a. Is this building that we've been talking about here, how large is that just for the present detachment? Is it for the 30 people or the 31 people? I mean, what have you put through for that?
I'll walk you through what the standard is. That there's a current detachment standard of 43, and we always do an occupancy of up plus 5 years because the buildings normally last 25, 30 years. So we're allowed to go out 5 years, and in this case, the current establishment is 45, and the projected over in the next 5-year period is 53. So which is a difference of eight to staff over a 5-year period. But then this building has to last another 25, 30. So, and that's based on historical figures and population growth.
Is that civilian plus RCMP?
Mr. Roden, you've got a couple more questions there.
Thank you, Your Worship. Again, from Mr. Frank Warren, his second question is, do you have a piece of land picked out for a joint building? And at this point in time, no, we don't. We're looking at a number of pieces of property. We're looking at looking at various combinations of building design. And the third question, and I guess this is for Fire Chief Mr. Dave McKenzie, is the plans call for a hose tower. Is it possible to consider a mechanism such as a hose dryer?
Yeah, anything's possible. You can. That's one way of taking one piece of the building away. You still have to accommodate for that room and the amount of hose that we have to run through the dryer and drying process. It could be very time-consuming, not very cost-efficient. And drying the hose, etc. It would be for hose tower. Plus, it eliminates one of our training needs that we need for daily training.
Mr. Gray.
I was looking at last year's budget, and in the budget it had a expenditure item projected of $1.1 million for the RCMP for upgrading cells and some other area in that. Did that take place?
Mr. Roden.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. That amount is also in this year's budget. The money hasn't been spent. It's a fairly long story. The RCMP identified at least 4 or 5 years ago that the current cell block was inadequate and that there had been attempted suicides, and I think possibly one suicide, and we needed to do something about it because we definitely did not meet the national standard. The city heard that, allocated about $500,000 initially, and from there the project became more complicated, more detailed. A significant amount of money was spent on preliminary drawings and design, and it was realized that once we had finished the cell block, there were any number of other problems with the RCMP building, security problems in other areas, ventilation problems, the fact that the building wasn't seismically safe. And we started working on that, and eventually that the 500,000 became $1 million, and then the $1 million became phase one of a 3-phase project that was now looking at to be $3 to $4 million, and it still wasn't going to solve all the problems. Then we would wind up with a building that looked a bit like a camel. So at that point in time, it was decided that we needed to stop this process and not throw any money, throw the old saying of throwing good money after bad, and take a fresh look at the whole question of possibly building a new building rather than just going through the renovation process.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Councillor Rafe, welcome. Did you have any questions or your?
Not okay. At this time. I need some catching up to do, I think.
All right.
Thank
Anybody else have any questions? Mr. Roden, is there anything else on the line or on the computer?
I haven't got any other emails, so I think that's it for right now.
Okay, Mr. Roden, I think we can move on to whatever it is you wanted to tell us.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to mention two things. The one was the question's been mooted, what's in it for the city in all of this? And I guess if the city guides the process, the city has more control over the process and what we'll finally wind up with. We've all heard that the RCMP have the capacity to let us know that the accommodation isn't suitable, and there's a process there that has not yet been followed apparently in BC, but apparently either the province could build a building or the RCMP could build a building, and the city would wind up carrying the cost, and we would lose control over the process, lose possibly control over the location. So what's in it for us is basically it's some control over the process and some control over the eventual cost and location of the building. The other question which was raised was, how about the RCMP rural? And that brings up the whole idea of co-location. There's a number of other organizations in town. There's the rural RCMP, there's the Canadian Border Services, and there's also ambulance services. And there's a potential for co-location with any and all of them. Unfortunately, as one of the gentlemen in the audience mentioned, there's not that many large pieces of property in Prince Rupert, so that the economies of scale that you may get from having a larger and larger and larger building may not be seen at a certain point because it's not feasible given the parcels and the site development which may need to be done. So the economy of scale may or may not be there. And the incremental costs of security and the costs of going up as opposed to going out are also problems that would need to be considered. But we are looking at them. The RCMP in a meeting last year said that they certainly would be interested possibly sometime in the future. But as you've heard tonight from Ms. Miller, they cannot commit at this point in time. So at best we would probably be prudent if we picked a site that could afford an extension at one end. The quip was, don't build a sloped roof, build a flat roof. The ambulance people were contacted last summer, and they own their own building in Prince Rupert, and so there's no capital savings for them in joining, and in fact, so they're not really interested at this point in time, was what I was told. Canadian Border Services, they've just been contacted recently, and they're looking at it, and we'll be able to get back to council on that. So thank you.
Councillor Ashley.
So related to that, the question about the RCMP contract being kind of in limbo, and I understand that the province can't commit until it can't commit until the RCMP contract is like settled and everybody knows everything. Is that what the situation is? Okay.
I can't speak on behalf of the province. I think that's really a conversation with the city and the province to take up.
Having no other questions, can I have a motion to adjourn? If seconded, all in favor? I just want to thank you all for coming this evening, and I hope everybody got all the questions asked that they wanted to, and that's, thank you for coming.